Kris Kristofferson was halfway through Me and Bobby McGee when he saw the gun. Not pointed at him, not yet. Just resting on the table in front of a man in the front row. A man whose name you whispered in Las Vegas but never spoke out loud. Kris stopped singing. The band kept playing for a few bars before trailing off into confused silence. The audience held its breath. And then Kris Kristofferson did something that would either make him a legend or get him killed. He set down his guitar, walked straight toward the mobster, and asked him if he wanted to come up and sing the next verse. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand Las Vegas in 1973. The city was still firmly in the grip of organized crime, though the facade of legitimacy was starting to crack. The casinos, the hotels, the entertainment venues, everything still ran through the mob, and everyone knew it. But things were changing. The old guard was being challenged. New players were moving in, and in that chaos, mistakes could get you killed. The International Hotel, where Kris was performing, was one of the newer, bigger venues on the Strip. It was trying to project a more modern, legitimate image, but the old connections were still there, just better hidden. Kris Kristofferson was an unusual choice for the venue. He wasn't a traditional Vegas act. He was a country singer-songwriter who'd made his name in Nashville, a former Rhodes Scholar and Army Ranger captain who'd given up everything to pursue music. He'd worked as a janitor at Columbia Records, famously landing a helicopter on Johnny Cash's lawn to get him to listen to his songs. He wrote Sunday Morning Comin' Down and Help Me Make It Through the Night. He was raw, authentic, and completely unpolished by Vegas standards. But in 1973, after the success of his albums and his emerging film career, Kris was hot. Vegas wanted him, even if he didn't quite fit the mold. The promoters thought his outsider credibility would bring in a younger, hipper crowd. They were right, but they also brought in the wrong kind of attention. Kris Kristofferson understood danger. He'd served in Germany as an army captain. He'd flown helicopters. He'd been trained to handle high-pressure situations. But more importantly, he had a deep-seated rebellious streak. He'd walked away from a prestigious military career and family pressure to chase a dream that seemed impossible. When you've already risked everything once, smaller risks don't seem so daunting. But even Kris wasn't prepared for what would happen on September 22nd, 1973. The trouble started 5 days earlier. Kris was in his dressing room at the International, going over the set list with his band, when there was a knock at the door. His road manager, a grizzled veteran of the music business named Tom Bledsoe, answered it. Standing in the hallway was a man in an expensive suit with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. "Mr. Kristofferson," the man said without preamble. "Mr. DeLuca would like to have dinner with you tomorrow night. He'll send a car at 7. Kris looked up from his guitar. "Who's Mr. DeLuca?" The man's expression didn't change. "Mr. DeLuca is a businessman here in Las Vegas. He'd like to discuss a potential opportunity with you." "What kind of opportunity?" "He'll discuss that over dinner." Kris set down his guitar and walked over to the door. "Well, tell Mr. DeLuca I appreciate the invitation, but I'm pretty booked up this week. Maybe another time." The man stared at Kris for a long moment. "Mr. DeLuca doesn't extend invitations lightly." "I'm sure he doesn't," Kris said evenly. "But I don't take meetings with people I don't know. If Mr. DeLuca wants to talk to me, he can come by after one of my shows and introduce himself properly. I'm happy to chat with anyone who takes the time to do that." The man's jaw tightened slightly. "I'll deliver your message." After he left, Tom Bledsoe closed the door and turned to Kris with wide eyes. "Do you have any idea who that was?" "Some guy who works for some businessman named DeLuca." "Some businessman?" "Kris, Anthony DeLuca runs half the illegal operations in Nevada. He's connected to the Chicago outfit. When he invites you to dinner, you go to dinner." Kris shrugged and picked up his guitar again. "Tom, I left the Army because I was tired of people telling me what to do. I'm not about to start taking orders from some gangster. If he wants to talk, he knows where to find me." Tom shook his head. "This isn't Nashville, Kris. These people don't play by the same rules." "Then maybe they should learn some new rules." Tom knew Kristofferson well enough to know that arguing was pointless. Once Kris made up his mind about something, especially when it involved his principles, there was no changing it. The next night, September 18th, Kris performed his show as usual. Afterward, he was in his dressing room when the same messenger appeared. Mr. DeLuca's car is waiting downstairs. Kris was changing out of his stage clothes. Tell Mr. DeLuca I already left. You're standing right here, Mr. Kristofferson. Am I? Kris said with a slight smile. Could have sworn I left 10 minutes ago. Must be my ghost you're talking to. The messenger didn't smile. Mr. DeLuca won't appreciate this. Then Mr. DeLuca should have come himself like I suggested. The man left without another word, but the tension in the air was palpable. Over the next 3 days, the atmosphere around the International Hotel changed. Staff members who usually chatted with Kris became distant. Security seemed more alert. Word was spreading that Anthony DeLuca was angry, and when Anthony DeLuca was angry, people got hurt. Tom Bledsoe tried repeatedly to get Kris to reconsider. Just meet with him. Hear what he has to say. It's probably nothing. If it's nothing, then why all the intimidation? Because that's how these guys operate. It's not personal, it's just business. Well, I don't do business that way, Kris said firmly. I don't respond well to threats, and I don't jump when someone snaps their fingers. If DeLuca wants something from me, he can ask me like a human being. On September 20th, 2 days before the incident, Tom got more information about what DeLuca wanted. He came to Kris's room at the hotel, looking worried. I talked to some people. I found out what this is about. And? DeLuca wants you to play at a private party, some kind of gathering for high-level mob guys from different families. He thinks having you there would be a big deal, good for his reputation. Kris laughed. He wants me to be his performing monkey for a bunch of gangsters? That's one way to put it. He'd pay you well, very well. I don't care if he'd pay me $1 million, Tom. I'm not doing it. I don't play private parties for people who think they can summon me like a servant. Kris, please. These aren't the kind of people you say no to. I just did. Tom left the room shaking his head, knowing that the situation was about to escalate. September 21st, the day before everything came to a head. The tension was now impossible to ignore. Kris's band members were nervous. The hotel staff was walking on eggshells. Everyone seemed to know that something bad was coming. That evening, after the show, Kris was approached by someone unexpected. A well-dressed older man who introduced himself as a friend of the hotel's ownership. Mr. Kristofferson, I've been asked to speak with you about Anthony DeLuca. I'm listening. Anthony is a very proud man. He feels you've disrespected him by refusing his invitations. He's not used to being refused. Then maybe it's good for him to experience something new. The man sighed. I'm trying to help you here. Anthony has done a lot for this hotel, for this city. He's a man who commands respect. Respect is earned, not commanded, Kris said, and sending messengers to intimidate people isn't the way to earn it. He just wants you to perform at a party, one night. Is that really worth risking your career over? Or worse? Kris looked the man in the eye. If my career depends on bowing to bullies, then maybe it's not worth having. I'll take my chances. The man shook his head sadly. I hope you know what you're doing, son. September 22nd, 1973. The day everything changed. Kris arrived at the International around 5 p.m. for his 8 p.m. show. The moment he walked into the building, he could feel it. The energy was different, dangerous. Tom Bledsoe was waiting for him, looking pale. Kris, we have a problem. What kind of problem? Anthony DeLuca bought out the first 5 rows for tonight's show, him and about 30 of his guys. They're coming. Kris was quiet for a moment, then said, well, they bought tickets. That means they're part of the audience. Kris, this isn't a joke. They're not coming to hear you sing. They're coming to make a statement. Then I guess I'll make one too. At 8 p.m., Kris Kristofferson walked onto the stage of the International Hotel showroom. The room held about 1,500 people, and it was packed. The atmosphere was electric with tension. People could sense that something was wrong. Kris looked out at the audience and immediately saw them. The first 5 rows were filled with men in dark suits, and in the center of the front row, directly in front of the stage, sat Anthony DeLuca. He was a stocky man with gray hair and cold, calculating eyes. He was staring directly at Kris with an expression that radiated menace. Kris picked up his guitar and adjusted the microphone. Good evening, folks. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm Kris Kristofferson, and I'm going to sing some songs for you. He started with Sunday Morning Comin' Down, one of his biggest hits. He sang it straight through, but he could feel DeLuca's eyes on him the entire time. The first 5 rows sat in complete silence, while the rest of the audience applauded enthusiastically. "Thank you," Kris said. "That's always been one of my favorites. Written it a long time ago, back when I was just trying to figure out who I was and what I wanted to say." He launched into For the Good Times, his voice rough and authentic, carrying the weight of genuine emotion. But halfway through the second verse, Anthony DeLuca did something that changed everything. He reached into his jacket. Kris's voice faltered for just a moment. Everyone in the front section tensed. But DeLuca wasn't pulling out a gun. He was pulling out a cigar. He lit it slowly, deliberately, never taking his eyes off Kris. Then he set something on the table in front of him. A gun. Just sitting there, clearly visible. Kris stopped singing. The band continued for a few more bars before realizing he'd stopped and trailing off into silence. The room went completely quiet. 1,500 people holding their breath. Kris stood there for a long moment, looking at Anthony DeLuca and the gun on the table. Then he carefully set down his guitar, propping it against the stool behind him. "Folks," Kris said, his voice calm and steady, "we're going to take a little detour from the planned program here. See, there's a gentleman in the front row who seems to have brought some interesting props to the show." He started walking toward the front of the stage. The audience tensed. DeLuca sat perfectly still, but his eyes narrowed. Kris reached the edge of the stage and looked down at the mobster. "Sir, I couldn't help but notice you've got a firearm there on your table. Now, I was in the Army for a few years, so I know a thing or two about weapons. That looks like a .45 caliber pistol, if I'm not mistaken. Nice piece." The room was dead silent. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Kris continued, his voice conversational, almost friendly. "But here's the thing. I've been in situations where weapons were necessary. Combat zones, training exercises, places where your life genuinely depended on having that piece of metal at your side. This, on the other hand, is a concert. We've got music, we've got people having a good time, and we've got a whole lot of folks who just want to hear some songs and forget about their troubles for a while." He paused, looking DeLuca directly in the eye. "So I'm wondering, what exactly are you trying to say with that gun? Because if you've got something to communicate, I'm right here. Why don't we just talk like human beings instead of playing these games?" DeLuca stared back at Kris without expression. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Everyone in the room waited to see what would happen next. Then Kris did something that nobody expected. He sat down on the edge of the stage, his feet dangling, bringing himself down to eye level with DeLuca. "Look, I'm going to be straight with you. I know you wanted me to play at your party. I know you're upset that I said no. But here's the thing. I don't know you. You never came to talk to me directly. You sent messengers, you made demands, you tried to intimidate me. That's not how I do things." He leaned forward slightly. "I've spent my whole life not doing what other people expected me to do. My family wanted me to be a soldier, make a career out of the military. I walked away from that. The music industry wanted me to write simple, commercial songs. I wrote what I felt instead. And when people tell me I have to do something, my natural instinct is to do the opposite." Kris gestured around the room. "But you know what? You're here now. We're talking. So why don't you tell me what you really want? Not through messengers, not through threats. Just you and me having a conversation." Anthony DeLuca continued to stare at Kris for another long moment. Then slowly he reached forward and picked up the gun. The entire room tensed. But instead of pointing it at Kris, DeLuca simply returned it to the holster inside his jacket. "You got balls, Kristofferson," DeLuca said, his voice carrying through the silent room. "I'll give you that." Kris smiled slightly. "Well, that or I'm just too dumb to know when I should be scared. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference." DeLuca's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Amusement? Respect? It was hard to say. "I wanted you at my party because it would have been good for my reputation," DeLuca said flatly. "Having a big star like you there, it sends a message, shows people I have influence." "I understand that," Kris said. But here's my problem with it. If I'd come running the first time you snapped your fingers, then I'd have been at your beck and call forever. Every time you wanted something, you'd expect me to jump. And that's not how I live my life. So what? You'd rather die than play a party? I'd rather die than live on my knees, Kris said simply. I learned that in the military, actually. You want respect from your troops. You don't get it by barking orders. You get it by earning it, by showing them you're worth following. DeLuca was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he said, "You're not like the other performers in this town." "No, I'm not. I'm a songwriter from Texas by way of California who ended up in Nashville and somehow wound up here. I don't know how to play the Vegas game, and I'm not sure I want to learn." "That could get you killed." "Maybe," Kris acknowledged, "but at least I'd die as myself, not as someone else's puppet." For the first time, Anthony DeLuca smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, but it was genuine. "You really are crazy, you know that? I've been told that before." DeLuca stood up from his seat. The men around him tensed, ready to act on whatever he commanded. But DeLuca just looked at Kris and said, "All right, Kristofferson, you win. You don't have to play my party. I appreciate that. But you're going to finish this show, and you're going to make it good. Because I paid for these seats, and I want to hear some damn music." Kris grinned and stood up. "That I can do." He walked back to center stage, picked up his guitar, and said to the audience, "Well, folks, looks like we got that sorted out. Now, where were we? Oh, right, I was in the middle of a song about loss and memory and trying to hold on to the good times even when everything's falling apart. Seems appropriate somehow." The audience laughed, more from relief than humor, and applauded. Anthony DeLuca sat back down, and his men followed suit. For the next 90 minutes, Kris performed one of the best shows of his Vegas run. He sang "Me and Bobby McGee," "Help Me Make It Through the Night," "Why Me," and a dozen other songs. He told stories between songs about his time as a janitor, his helicopter landing on Johnny Cash's lawn, and his general confusion about how a guy like him ended up playing Vegas. Anthony DeLuca and his men stayed for the entire show. And when it was over, they stood and applauded along with everyone else. After the show, Kris was in his dressing room when there was a knock at the door. Tom opened it, and Anthony DeLuca was standing there, alone this time. "Can I come in?" DeLuca asked. Kris nodded. "Sure. You want a drink?" "Yeah, bourbon if you got it." Kris poured 2 glasses and handed one to DeLuca. They stood there for a moment in silence. Finally, DeLuca spoke. "You know, I've had a lot of people scared of me in my life. Politicians, businessmen, other guys in my line of work. Fear is a useful tool. It keeps people in line." "I can see how it would." "But you weren't scared, not even a little bit." Kris took a sip of his bourbon. "Oh, I was scared. I'd be an idiot not to be. But I was more scared of becoming the kind of person who caves to threats than I was of whatever you might do to me." DeLuca smiled slightly. "Most people would say that's backwards." "Most people probably have better survival instincts than I do." DeLuca finished his drink and set the glass down. "Here's the thing, Kristofferson. I respect what you did tonight. You stood your ground, you didn't fold, and you did it without being disrespectful. You just held your line. I appreciate that. We're good, you and me. You don't owe me anything. I don't owe you anything. Clean slate." Kris extended his hand. "Sounds fair to me." DeLuca shook it. "But next time someone like me sends someone to talk to you, maybe just take the meeting. Save everyone a lot of trouble." Kris smiled. "I'll take it under advisement. That's all I can ask." DeLuca headed for the door, then stopped and turned back. "You really landed a helicopter on Johnny Cash's lawn?" "I really did. That's almost as crazy as what you did tonight. The helicopter thing worked out better. Johnny listened to my songs." DeLuca laughed, a genuine laugh this time. "You're all right, Kristofferson. You're all right." And just like that, it was over. Anthony DeLuca left, and Kris Kristofferson had survived what could have been the most dangerous night of his life. But the story didn't end there. What happened that night at the International spread through Las Vegas faster than a wildfire in August. By the next morning, everyone in the entertainment business knew about it. Kris Kristofferson had stood up to Anthony DeLuca, and not only had he survived, he'd earned the mobster's respect. The incident changed something about how people viewed Kris. Before, he'd been seen as an outsider, a Nashville guy playing Vegas but not really part of Vegas. After that night, he was something different. He was the guy who'd faced down a mob boss with nothing but honesty and courage. Other performers started seeking Kris out for advice. How did you do it? How did you know he wouldn't kill you? How did you stay so calm? Kris's answer was always the same. I didn't know. I just knew I couldn't live with myself if I backed down. Everything else was just details. Johnny Cash called him a few days later. Heard you had some excitement out there in Vegas. You could say that. You know you're crazy, right? So I've been told, Johnny laughed. Well, it's that same crazy that got you to land a helicopter on my lawn. I guess some things never change. I guess not. Just be careful, Kris. The world needs your songs. Don't get yourself killed before you write them all. I'll do my best, John. Over the years, the story of that night at the International grew into legend. Different people told different versions. Some said Kris had picked up the gun and handed it back to DeLuca. Others said DeLuca had actually pulled the gun and Kris had talked him down. None of those versions were completely accurate, but they spoke to how the incident had captured people's imaginations. The truth was both simpler and more profound. Kris Kristofferson had faced a genuinely dangerous situation with authenticity and courage. He hadn't pretended to be tougher than he was. He hadn't tried to out-intimidate the intimidator. He'd just been himself, honest, principled, and willing to accept the consequences of his choices. That authenticity, that willingness to be vulnerable while standing firm, was what had saved him. Anthony DeLuca had spent his life around tough guys who postured and pretended. Kris's genuine, unvarnished honesty had been something different, something DeLuca could respect. Anthony DeLuca and Kris Kristofferson never became friends, but they maintained a mutual respect. DeLuca came to a few more of Kris's shows over the years, always sitting in the front row, always applauding enthusiastically, and Kris always acknowledged him from the stage with a nod and a slight smile. In 1979, Anthony DeLuca died of a heart attack. It was a natural death, unusual for a man in his line of work. When Kris heard the news, he was quoted as saying, "Anthony was a complicated man living in a complicated world, but he understood respect, and in his own way, he lived by a code. Can't ask much more than that." Years later, when Kris was asked about that night in September 1973, he always downplayed it. "People make too much of it. I just didn't want to play a party I didn't want to play, so I said no. The rest was just working through the consequences of that choice." But those who were there that night knew better. They'd witnessed something rare, a moment when principle and courage transformed a potentially deadly situation into something else entirely. A moment of genuine human connection between two men from completely different worlds. Kris Kristofferson built his entire career on authenticity. He wrote songs that told hard truths about life, love, loss, and the human condition. He never pretended to be something he wasn't. He never sold out his principles for commercial success. But that night at the International Hotel, it wasn't just a career strategy. It was who he genuinely was. And that authenticity, that unwavering commitment to being true to himself, had saved his life. The image of Kris sitting on the edge of the stage, talking to Anthony DeLuca like they were two guys having a conversation at a bar rather than a performer and a mobster in a standoff, became symbolic of everything Kris represented. He didn't see himself as above anyone or below anyone. He was just a man trying to live his life according to his own principles. That's the real story of the night. A mob boss threatened Kris Kristofferson in Las Vegas. No gunfight, no dramatic escape, no movie-style heroics. Just one man refusing to compromise his principles and another man respecting him for it. In the end, that's what made Kris Kristofferson legendary. Not just his songwriting talent, not just his rough-hewn charisma, but his absolute refusal to be anything other than himself, no matter who was watching or what the consequences might be. Kris Kristofferson was the real deal, and on September 22, 1973, in a showroom at the International Hotel in Las Vegas, he proved it in the most dangerous way possible. He looked danger in the eye, stayed true to himself, and walked away intact. That's not just cool, that's courage. Pure, authentic, unvarnished courage. The kind that can't be faked and can't be learned. The kind you either have or you don't. Kris Kristofferson had it. And on that night in Vegas, when it mattered most, he showed the world exactly what he was made of.